Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about a meme that's been making the social media rounds again. I've seen this meme before, but it's cropped up again on several of the Facebook groups that I'm part of. You'll see the meme up on the screen here. It's got a Venn diagram at the top that says what the author meant in one circle, what your English teacher thinks the author meant in the other circle, and there's very little overlap between them. And then below, it's got an example. For instance, the curtains were blue. What your teacher thinks the curtains represent his immense depression and his lack of will to carry on. What the author meant, the curtains were fucking blue. Now, I get the joke. Don't imagine that I don't understand the humor here. And I'm not inherently opposed to it, but I also think it's worth talking about critically. And yes, I recognize I'm doing what the meme suggests English teachers do. I don't care. As English instructors and as scholars and critical thinkers, our job is to analyze texts. This meme is a text. It therefore is open to analysis. So, I think there's some profound misunderstandings about what literary analysis actually is and involves here. And I think that's important, not just because I am an English teacher and I have a vested interest in protecting the perceived legitimacy of the thing that I do, but also because what this meme fundamentally critiques is a type of critical thinking. And it critiques that type of critical thinking by suggesting that critical thought is somehow unfounded or is somehow arbitrary. So I want to talk about that. Why do I think this meme belittles the idea of critical thought? Well, because what the teacher is doing in this instance is interpreting a text. They are thinking critically about what the elements within this text tell us about the world envisioned by the text itself. Is this in itself a good argument that this English teacher is making? No. If the only thing that we have to go on to read a character's attitude or worldview is the color of the curtains, then that is simply not sufficient. That's also not in practice what English teachers or scholars do. If you wanted to make the argument that this character has immense depression and lack of will to carry on, you need more than just the curtains were blue. However, if you have more evidence for that, and the curtains are blue, then this is a resonance, right? This is something that hints at the character's general attitude. It's not in itself conclusive proof, but it can be supporting evidence alongside other evidence. Now, I'll give you a real-world example of this from something I'm working on at the moment. I'm writing a psychoanalytic analysis of Taylor Swift's song Love Story. I'm reading it as Shakespearean texts, basically. I argue in one portion of the article that Swift's song is obsessed with the idea of being watched. There is a paranoid fantasy here. That is, the narrator is deeply concerned with the idea of being observed and the intention of evading that observation. Now, if what I had for that was one reference to someone watching the character, I could not make a good argument for that. However, there's a lot in there. References to seeing and eyes get repeated, I think it's something like 6 times in the 8 lines of the first stanza of the song. That's a substantial amount for a short section of lyrics. From that, I can make the case, along with other elements in the song, that this is a thematic concern. And this is how real scholarly analysis works. And so chances are, if your teacher, your instructor, whatever it is, has said at some point, the curtains are blue, which tells us this character is depressed, chances are they have also gone through a similar process where they're analyzing multiple components of the text. and they're putting together an argument and using this as a piece of evidence. Again, if this is the entirety of their evidence and the story or whatever it is otherwise about someone who is apparently quite happy and whatnot, then yeah, they're probably just wrong. And that's fine. That does happen. Everybody makes mistakes. I do too. But the idea that that English instructors just make stuff up out of a desire to find arbitrary depth in things is really not an accurate representation of this. But I think there's larger stakes here because it misrepresents the process of critical thinking, right? It presents the process of critical thinking and of analysis as, oh, I'm just arbitrarily making nonsense claims. The things that I'm saying are not in any way rooted in reality, and they don't matter, and they don't mean anything. So that's one of the problems here. In the world we live in today, the post-truth society, the post-fact society, although I think we've thankfully moved a little bit away from the post-truth and post-fact society, although there's still many people who live in delusion world, critiques of critical thinking feed into that kind of skepticism, that kind of anti-intellectualism. This sense that people who are educated and who have knowledge about particular subjects are in some ways untrustworthy. That we as experts, to the extent that I'm an expert, should not be taken seriously. Our interpretations, our understandings of the things in our own fields are somehow fundamentally unreliable. And so that's, I think, a big problem because it erodes and devalues critical interpretation and critical thinking skills, which contributes to people buying into complete nonsense, like flat earth theory or the idea that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. But there's another element here, because the other thing that the meme does is it privileges the author's interpretation of their own work. If the author meant something, then that's the only thing it can mean. And I have a profound problem with this. Now, I'm not inherently a reader response person, but in this instance, I would lean more toward the reader response thing, because what we're analyzing when we analyze a text is a text. It's not the author's intention. When I sit down to read a book, a novel or a play or a poem or look at a movie or whatever it is, I'm not analyzing the author's intention. That's simply not what I'm doing. That would be a fruitless exercise. If my goal when I read Oedipus the King or The Sun Also Rises or Things Fall Apart or whatever it is, was to figure out what Sophocles or Ernest Hemingway or Chinua Achebe meant, I can't do it. That's a fruitless exercise from a literary studies perspective. If the goal is to determine the author's intention, I can make guesses, but that's pointless. It also doesn't really matter that much. Like, why would it be important if the author just meant that the curtains were blue? Because within the text, that may have more meaning than the author intended. Partially, this is rooted in the philosophy of a guy named Jacques Derrida, who is the driving force of what's called deconstruction, which is premised on the idea that a text always, even language, always means more than we intend it to mean. That there are always things there are always resonances, connotations, echoes that go beyond what we as speakers or writers intend to say. But the other thing is, it kind of just doesn't matter at the end of the day what the author meant to do. This is called the authorial intent fallacy, the idea that if the author meant it to mean something, it can mean nothing else. let me give you an analogy to explain why this doesn't work. Let's say I wanted to build a table, and my goal was to build a beautiful, functional table that everyone would marvel at its ingenuity and lovely functionality, right? I wanted to build the perfect table. But what I in fact built was slanted at a 45-degree angle and had one leg. There was a big hole in the middle of it. It was the shittiest, least useful table that's ever been made in the history of table making. Does my intention to make a perfect table mean that that is a perfect table? No. The table is shit. The table does not work properly because the table itself does not work properly. The thing that is created is not necessarily what the creator intended. And the intention of the creator doesn't alter the thing that was created, right? Just because I meant for that table to be perfect doesn't make it so if it's not. The same thing applies to texts. Maybe the author, when they wrote that line, were just describing a room. Maybe they were just describing the color of the curtains. Maybe they were even describing a real place. But we're not concerned with that. That's not what we're analyzing. I'm not trying to figure out what did the author mean when they said this. I'm trying to figure out what does the text do. So this is the thing. If that table does not function, if I can't eat off of it or put papers on it to write off of it or whatever it is you do with your table, the fact that the author, the creator in this case, intended it to be a perfect table is irrelevant to the actual text itself, the text in this case being the table. So that's the thing. It's like, if within a text where we have a bunch of suggestions that the character is depressed, that they lack the will to go on, whatever it is, if I then say, in addition to that, the curtains are blue, and that symbolically represents this, or symbolically aligns with this, then that argument is not wrong. That argument is a legitimate interpretation of the text, even if the author themselves did not intend that. And that's kind of the point here at the end of the day, is this idea that we can or should only read texts in the way the author intended them. It's a profoundly limiting and anti-intellectual way of looking at texts and of looking at critical analysis. Because if the author can say, here is the definitive meaning, no other meaning is possible, that's just a complete submission to their authority. That they get to say what is true. And if I see something different and can make a good argument for it, that's necessarily invalid because the author's authority overrides mine. Now, I think we should take a serious interest in what authors say about their work. But the reality is, the author constructs a text, and a text does more than the author intends it to. The idea that they get final say over it is profoundly problematic in terms of how we read and understand the world around us.